Hello guys, Lucas here. Today I'm going to talk about the primitive data types. And what are primitive data types, you might ask? Well, they are the fundamental of programming. These are also called variables and can be seen as containers for a value. And there are four main data types that we're going to talk about, and these contain different types of data. There's the name data types. So first of all, we have integer. This is a type that can contain integers, which essentially are numbers. These numbers cannot have decimals. They can only be whole numbers or integers. They can, however, be negative. So this is probably the most common used type overall, especially for numbers. And you declare a variable by first declaring which type it has, then declaring its name or reference so you can find it again essentially, or change it later, and then you initialize it with a value. You can also leave it without a value and then assign it a value later if you want, but usually you will just initialize it right away so we know what value it has. Then there's floats, and floats are similar to integers. They can, however, have decimals. So we have 36.6 here, and F here is not for Fahrenheit, even though it's a temperature. It's actually for float, because that's necessary when defining floats. Otherwise it will confuse it with another type called double, and we don't want that to happen. Therefore we put an F to tell the compiler that this is a float. Now you know that. So yeah, floats, decimal numbers, can also be negative just like integers, but yeah. Then we have booleans. These are typed bool, and this is a true-false value. These are used a lot, and also the other data types are often reduced to a boolean. If you for instance check if a number is greater than another number, then you get a boolean, because it can either be true or false. But you can also just straight up write true or false as a value. So here we have whether it is sunny or not. So yeah, these can also be used as checkboxes in some interfaces, but either way they always just consider true or false in the code. And then last we have string, which is a piece of text. Those are also very common, especially if you want to write something to the console. It will always be converted to a string. So yeah, these are the main primitive data types that you need to know. Later in the video I will go over some of the other types, more unique types, but if you're new to programming, you can skip that part, because these are the most essential ones, essentially. Here we can then write the values of our different types and variables, I should say. And then we can modify them. And modifying variables is different from type to type. If we have the integer, we can do some simple math operations, like take it and then increment it by 2. This will leave whatever value it has plus 2. We can also, if we have a float, do some simple math with decimals. You can also use decimals with integers. But then you would need to cast it and stuff, and it will basically just round off to the nearest integer. So we won't do that for now. Then we have booleans. You can, if you want to flip a boolean, you can just use exclamation mark, because that means not. So is sunny equals not is sunny, so the opposite. You can also say equals false. And then we have strings. And to strings you can add more strings to extend the string to a bigger string, essentially. That's how we modify the different data types. And then we can print the modified data types and see what happens. Okay, so as you can see, we start by printing the original values, 21, 36.6, true, and Lucas. And then after modifying them, right here, we print them again. And we have 23, 18.3, so we have this value, and false, and Lucas Johansson. So yeah, that's how they're working. The next up is if statements, which also use these primitives. So this is basically, as it says, if this, then this, else this. So basically it evaluates whether or not age is greater than 18, and if that's true, so that is reduced to a boolean essentially. If that is true, it will do this command, and if it's not true, or in other words false, it would do this command. And we can also do that directly with booleans. And another trick we can do here, if you want to be extra fancy, is to remove the equals true, because it's a boolean. So if this is essentially just asking if it is true. Also note that this this sign is not the same as this sign. So singular equal sign just means that put this variable to this value. So this variable gets this value, and double equal sign means is this value equal to this value. So that basically converts it to a boolean. And yeah, we can also do more fancy stuff with strings, like check if it starts with something, all types of fancy stuff. But anyways, this was the simple part, and stay around if you want to learn about the other primitives. Okay, so the other types are byte, which is essentially an integer, but it has less data, so it can only store a number between 0 and 225, because it, as the name suggests, has 1 byte of storage. And an integer has 4 bytes as far as I remember, so it can have 2 billions and negative 2 billions as far as I remember. Then we have longs, which is also essentially an integer, so still non-decimal numbers, but these are way huger than integers and can store larger numbers. These two types are not that common, so you basically only use them in some specific purposes. Most of the time you will use integers. Then we have double, which is a decimal number, and it's more precise than a float and can also store more decimals. Most of the time you will probably use double over float because it's more precise, but it also consumes more space in your memory and stuff. Then we have char, which is a singular character, and a string, as before, is basically a list, of chars, or more precisely an array, but that's a tale for another something. Anyways, a char is just a singular character. And then we have the keyword var, and that is very odd because it's not a type. It is, however, a way to declare variables, and it is implicit instead of explicit, so it can basically be any of the above or even non-primitives. So I like to call it a shapeshifter type, even though it's not a type, because it can stand in for any type. And I have a setting on that shows what type it actually stands in for right now. So right now it's just an int, because we defined it with a whole number. If we did f, it would be a float, or 2.2 it will be a double. So yeah, it can change, but one thing it cannot do, it cannot change afterwards. It can only get its value when it's initialized. That's worth noting. But yeah, I wouldn't recommend using these unless you are confident in the different types, because when you use var, if not confident in the types, you won't learn how to use the types. So yeah, unless you're confident in types, then try to avoid this keyword. But it was worth mentioning. So yeah, I hope you learned something, and see you around next time. Bye.